Commander Jackson Reed had made exactly 3 major mistakes in his distinguished military career. The first involved accidentally declaring war on a peaceful mining colony due to a translation error. The second involved trusting his navigation officer's assurance that, "Those aren't asteroids, sir. They're just really ugly planets." The third, and by far the most spectacular, was smuggling his 5-year-old daughter aboard humanity's first formal diplomatic mission to meet the galaxy's apex predators. But really, who could blame him? 6 months away from Rosie's gap-toothed grin and her inexplicable ability to turn every mundane object into either a spaceship or a dinosaur. The man had standards. Low ones, apparently, but standards nonetheless. The hegemony's pride stretched before them like a monument to controlled violence. 3 kilometers of gunmetal gray hull, bristling with weapons that could crack planets like walnuts. The Kitharian Empire's flagship made humanity's newest diplomatic vessel look like a particularly ambitious paper airplane, which, considering their track record with first contact situations, might actually be an improvement. "Jackson," Dr. Amelia Reed whispered, her voice carrying that special tone reserved for husbands who'd made catastrophically poor decisions. "Please tell me you have a plan that doesn't involve our daughter accidentally starting an interstellar incident." Commander Reed adjusted his dress uniform, trying to project confidence, while simultaneously wondering if it was too late to fake a medical emergency. "Of course I do. The plan is foolproof. The last time you said something was foolproof, we ended up married." "Exactly. And look how well that turned out." Amelia's laugh was somewhere between amused and homicidal. "We're about to meet 12-foot-tall lizard warriors who consider showing mercy a capital offense, and you brought our kindergartner. She's very mature for her age. She still believes her stuffed elephant is a licensed therapist. Dr. Snuggles has excellent credentials." The docking bay of the hegemony's pride opened with a sound like the universe clearing its throat. Beyond the atmospheric barrier, a delegation of Kithans waited with the patience of creatures who'd evolved past the need for small talk. Each stood nearly twice human height, their scaled armor gleaming under harsh lighting that made everything look like a particularly ominous medical examination. War Prime Vextar dominated the center of the formation, a living mountain of muscle and controlled aggression who managed to make standing still look like an act of violence. His amber eyes fixed on the approaching humans with the interest of a scientist studying bacteria cultures, particularly disappointing bacteria cultures. "Commander Reed," Vextar's voice rumbled through the translation matrix with all the warmth of a glacier learning to speak. "The Kitharian Empire acknowledges your presence." Jackson had practiced this moment for months. He'd rehearsed diplomatic protocols, studied Kitharian customs, and memorized 17 different ways to avoid accidentally challenging anyone to ritual combat. He stepped forward with what he hoped was appropriate dignity. "War Prime Vextar, humanity is honored by your—" "Daddy? Why do the space lizards look so grumpy?" The diplomatic corps had not prepared him for this scenario. Rosie Reed, all 43 pounds of kindergarten curiosity, had apparently decided that hiding behind her parents was for amateurs. She emerged from behind Amelia's legs like a tiny ambassador of chaos, her favorite purple dress somehow managing to look both adorable and completely inappropriate for a military vessel designed by apex predators. The silence that followed could have been weaponized. War Prime Vextar's massive head tilted with the mechanical precision of a targeting system acquiring a new threat. His amber eyes, each larger than Rosie's entire face, focused on the small human with an intensity typically reserved for enemy commanders or particularly challenging prey. "You," he said slowly. The translation matrix, struggling with what might have been confusion, brought a juvenile to a military negotiation. "Well," Jackson began, his carefully prepared diplomatic responses crumbling like cookies in a blender. "You see, there were child care complications, and—" "We don't eat the babies of our enemies," Vextar interrupted, which was possibly the most reassuring thing he could have said, while somehow sounding incredibly threatening. "It spoils the victory." "That's good to know." Rosie, apparently unimpressed by 12 feet of armored death machine, took a step closer to Vextar and craned her neck back at an angle that suggested she might topple over backward. "Are you a dragon?" The other Kithans shifted with movements that managed to convey both amusement and disbelief. Their war prime, the terror of 3 star systems, was being interrogated by something that barely reached his knee. "I am a Kitharian warrior," Vextar replied, with the careful precision of someone explaining basic concepts to a particularly slow student. "But you look like a dragon. Do you breathe fire?" "No." "That's too bad. Dragons should breathe fire. It's like the whole point." Amelia stepped forward, her xenobiologist training warring with her maternal instincts. "Rosie, honey, remember what we talked about? Inside voice, and no interviewing the scary aliens." "He's not scary," Rosie announced with the absolute certainty that only 5-year-olds could muster. "He's just really, really big. Like a friendly mountain." War Prime Vextar made a sound that the translation matrix rendered as static. Several of his subordinates' head crests flared in what human observers had learned to recognize as barely controlled mirth. Their commander, meanwhile, appeared to be experiencing something between bewilderment and existential crisis. "The bow, juvenile," he said carefully, "does not display appropriate fear responses." "She's working on it," Jackson said weakly. "Daddy, can I pet the dragon?" "Absolutely not." "Please." "No." "Pretty please, with space cherries on top." Jackson felt the weight of galactic diplomacy pressing down on him like a collapsed star. Humanity's first impression with the most powerful predator species in known space was apparently going to involve his daughter's attempts at interspecies animal husbandry. "War Prime Vextar," he began, with as much dignity as he could summon. "Perhaps we could proceed to the conference room while my wife manages our daughter." Vextar's gaze never left Rosie, who had apparently decided that being the center of attention from a dozen apex predators was perfectly normal. "Your offspring shows no survival instincts. She's very trusting. This is a weakness." "Sometimes," Amelia said quietly, "it's a strength." The Kitharian commander's head crest rippled in a pattern that suggested deep thought or possibly indigestion. "Explain." "Trust allows cooperation. Cooperation allows survival in situations where individual strength fails." "Cooperation," Vextar repeated the word like he was tasting something exotic and potentially poisonous. "Your species cooperates with weakness?" "Our species protects weakness, so it can become strength." Rosie chose that moment to reach into her small backpack and pull out a slightly crumpled picture book. "I brought stories. Do space dragons like stories?" The delegation of Kitharian warriors, each one capable of single-handedly conquering a small planet, stared at the colorful book with expressions that suggested they were witnessing something unprecedented and possibly dangerous. "Stories," Vextar said slowly, "are for juveniles." "I am a juvenile," Rosie pointed out with flawless logic. "And stories are for everyone, That's what makes them stories. War Prime Vextar looked from the small human to her parents, then back to the small human who was apparently attempting to revolutionize Kitherian culture through the power of children's literature. His amber eyes narrowed in what might have been calculation. "The conference will proceed as planned," he announced. "Your offspring will remain supervised." "Thank you," Jackson said, relief flooding through him like cold water on burning electronics. "However," Vexitar continued, and Jackson's relief evaporated, "the juvenile will be monitored by our security protocols. She will not be permitted to wander." "Of course, absolutely. She'll stay right with us." Rosie, who had been listening to this exchange with the careful attention of someone planning a prison break, smiled sweetly. It was the same smile she used when she'd already hidden cookies in her room for later consumption. Jackson felt a familiar chill of parental dread. As the delegation moved deeper into the hegemony's pride, the ship's corridors seemed to swallow sound and hope in equal measure. Everything was built to Kitherian scale, massive, intimidating, and designed by beings who considered architectural flourishes a sign of weakness. The walls were lined with what appeared to be trophy cases displaying the weapons and armor of defeated enemies, though Amelia noted quietly that some of the trophies looked suspiciously like children's toys from various species. "Daddy," Rosie whispered as they walked, her small hand firmly grasped in his. "Why is everyone so serious? Don't they know any jokes?" "I don't think the Kithrans do humor, sweetheart." "That's sad. Everyone should know at least one joke. It's like a rule." War Prime Vextar's head turned slightly at this pronouncement, but he continued walking without comment. The conference room, when they finally reached it, was exactly what Jackson had expected. A vast chamber designed to make visitors feel small and insignificant. The ceiling stretched up into shadows, and the table was carved from what appeared to be a single piece of black stone. Ancient Kitherian script covered the walls, probably detailing their many victories over species foolish enough to oppose them. "Before we begin," Vextar announced as they took their seats, "you will observe our most prized achievements." A section of the wall became transparent, revealing an observation deck that extended from the ship's hull like a crystalline bubble. And there, in the center of the transparent space, lay 6 juvenile Kithans. Jackson's breath caught. Each of the young predators was already the size of a full-grown human, their scales gleaming with health, and their movements displaying the lethal grace that would make them terrors in a few more years. They moved around their enclosure, with the restless energy of apex predators waiting to be unleashed upon the galaxy. "Our next generation of war primes," Vextar said with unmistakable pride, "kept in isolation to maintain their killer instincts, fed on the flesh of our enemy's young to ensure proper aggression development." Amelia's hand tightened on her datapad. "You feed them children?" "Synthetic reconstructions," Vexitar clarified, with what might have been amusement. "We are not wasteful, but the psychological conditioning remains effective." Rosie had gone very quiet, staring at the observation deck with wide eyes. The juvenile Kitharans moved through their space with mechanical precision, never interacting, never playing, never showing any sign of the social behaviors that characterized most pack hunters. "They look lonely," she whispered. "They are being trained," Vexitar corrected. "Loneliness is weakness. Weakness is death. But they're just kids. They are weapons." Jackson felt the conversation taking a dangerous turn and tried to redirect. "Perhaps we could discuss the trade agreements." "I want to see them up close," Rosie announced, with the quiet determination of someone who had already made up her mind. "Absolutely not," both her parents said simultaneously. Please? Just for a minute? Rosie? No. But they look sad. War Prime Vextar made that static sound again. Your offspring believes she can evaluate the emotional state of Kitherian juveniles? She's very empathetic, Amelia said carefully. Empathy is a survival flaw. Sometimes, Jackson found himself saying, survival flaws become survival advantages in unexpected situations. The meeting proceeded with all the warmth and efficiency of a funeral conducted by accountants. Trade routes were discussed, defensive pacts were analyzed, and cultural exchange programs were politely declined by beings who considered cultural exchange a form of contamination. Throughout it all, Rosie sat quietly in her chair, occasionally coloring in a book, but more often staring through the transparent wall at the juvenile Kithans. Jackson noticed she'd grown increasingly fidgety as the hours passed, which was never a good sign. "Daddy," she whispered during a particularly dry discussion of mineral rights, "I need to go to the bathroom. Can you wait a few more minutes? It's kind of urgent." Amelia stood smoothly. "I'll take her. We'll be right back." War Prime Vextar nodded dismissively, his attention focused on contract details that would determine humanity's place in the greater galactic community. Jackson should have known better. He should have remembered every previous instance of his daughter's creative problem-solving. He should have recognized the signs. But he was too busy trying to prevent an interstellar incident to notice that Rosie Reed had just been handed the perfect opportunity to create one. Dr. Amelia Reed should have known something was wrong when her daughter spent exactly 30 seconds in the bathroom before announcing she was all done with suspicious enthusiasm. She should have recognized the signs when Rosie emerged with that particular gleam in her eyes, the same look she got when she'd figured out how to reprogram the household cleaning bots to play fetch. But Amelia was a xenobiologist, not a child psychologist, and she was too busy marveling at the ship's advanced life support systems to notice that her 5-year-old had just activated what would later be known as the most successful diplomatic breakthrough in human history. "Mommy," Rosie said, with the careful innocence of someone executing a master plan, "can we take the long way back? I want to see more of the ship." "Sweetheart, we need to get back to Daddy and the scary space lizards. Just a little exploring." "Please." The corridor they were walking through branched in 3 directions, each marked with Kitherian script that Amelia's translation implant rendered as combat training, weapons storage, and restricted access observation deck. Rosie, who couldn't read Kitherian but possessed the supernatural navigation abilities of all 5-year-olds, immediately pointed toward the restricted corridor. "That way looks interesting." "Absolutely not. That says restricted." "But what if there's something really cool down there?" "Then it's restricted for a good reason." Amelia turned toward the conference room, expecting to hear the patter of small feet following behind her. Instead, she heard the distinctive sound of a kindergartner discovering that some doors weren't actually locked, just intimidatingly labeled. "Rosie!" But her daughter had already vanished around the corner, with the efficiency of someone who'd spent years perfecting the art of strategic disappearance. Amelia ran after her, her heart performing gymnastics routines that would have impressed Olympic judges. The restricted corridor stretched ahead like an accusation, lined with warning symbols that probably translated to things like authorized personnel only and trespassers will be converted into decorative wall art. The observation deck's entrance stood open, because apparently even the galaxy's most feared predators occasionally forgot to lock doors behind them, and Amelia could hear her daughter's voice drifting through the opening. "Hi there! You're all so big and pretty." Amelia's blood pressure achieved escape velocity. She reached the observation deck's threshold and stopped dead, her xenobiologist training warring with her maternal instincts as she processed a scene that shouldn't have been possible according to everything humanity knew about Kitherian behavior. Rosie sat cross-legged in the center of the transparent dome, completely surrounded by 6 juvenile Kithans, each one large enough to use her as a toothpick. Her picture book lay open in her lap, and she was reading aloud in the patient voice she typically reserved for explaining complex concepts to her stuffed animals. And then the little rabbit said to the big scary wolf, "But, Mr. Wolf, you don't have to be mean just because everyone expects you to be mean. Maybe you could try being nice instead, and see how that feels." The juvenile Kithans listened with the rapt attention of students attending the most important lecture of their lives. Their amber eyes never left Rosie's face, and their massive heads tilted at angles that suggested they were processing information that challenged everything they'd been taught. The smallest of the group, though smallest, was relative when dealing with creatures that could bench press small vehicles, had actually lowered his great head until it rested near Rosie's knee. His breathing had synchronized with her reading rhythm, and occasionally he made soft, rumbling sounds that Amelia recognized as expressions of contentment. Amelia's scientific mind catalogued the impossibility of what she was witnessing. Kitherian juveniles were supposed to be asocial killing machines, programmed from birth to view any non-Kitherian as either prey or competition. They should have torn Rosie apart within seconds of her entering their space. Instead, they'd formed a perfect protective circle around her, their positioning suggesting they were guarding rather than threatening. "Mommy!" Rosie looked up with the bright smile of someone who'd just made 6 new best friends. "Look, they like stories." "Rosie," Amelia said carefully, "I need you to come here very slowly. But I'm not done reading yet. We're at the best part, where the rabbit teaches the wolf how to make friends." The smallest juvenile made a questioning sound and nudged Rosie's hand with his snout. She giggled and scratched behind what Amelia assumed were his ears, though the anatomy was admittedly unclear. "This one's name is Patches," Rosie announced. "He told me so." "Sweetheart, they don't speak—" "Not with words," Rosie interrupted, with the patient tone children used when adults were being particularly dense. "But he's definitely Patches. Look at his scales. They're all different colors, like someone spilled paint on him." Amelia looked and realized her daughter was right. Unlike the uniform coloration of adult Kithans, this juvenile displayed patches of gold, bronze, and deep green across his hide in patterns that were actually quite beautiful. "And that one's grumpy," Rosie continued, pointing to a larger juvenile whose head crest was permanently flared in what looked like perpetual annoyance. "And that one's sleepy. And that one's—" "You're naming them after the 7 dwarfs. There's only 6 of them, so I had to pick the best ones. Though I might change Grumpy to Stubborn because he keeps trying to sit between me and the door like he's protecting me or something." Amelia's xenobiologist training kicked into overdrive. Pack behavior, protective positioning, social bonding with an outside species. Everything she was witnessing violated established Kitherian behavioral patterns, but it also made perfect sense from an evolutionary standpoint. "Oh no," she whispered, as the implications hit her. "Oh, this is bad. This is really, really bad." "What's bad?" They're being very good listeners. "Rosie, I need you to—" "Dr. Reed!" Commander Reed's voice echoed through the corridor with all the panic of a man who'd just realized his daughter had wandered into the galactic equivalent of a lion's den. His footsteps pounded against the deck plating, accompanied by the heavier tread of Kitherian warriors moving at what was probably their version of a concerned jog. "In here!" Amelia called back, never taking her eyes off the juveniles, who had gone very still at the sound of approaching adults. Commander Reed burst through the entrance at a dead run, followed by War Prime Vextar and half a dozen Kitherian guards, all armed and looking like they were preparing for the galaxy's most tragic hostage situation. "Rosie, get away from—" Jackson stopped mid-sentence as his brain processed the scene before him. War Prime Vextar made a sound like a mountain having an existential crisis. The juvenile Kithans had shifted position at the arrival of the adults, but not in the way anyone expected. Instead of moving toward the potential threat, they'd closed ranks around Rosie, their massive forms creating an impenetrable wall of scales and protective instincts. "What?" Vexitar said slowly, his voice carrying undertones that the translation matrix struggled to render. "Has your offspring done to our juveniles?" "I read them a story," Rosie said helpfully. "They really liked the part about friendship." "Friendship," Vexitar repeated the word like it was a foreign concept, which, Amelia realized, it probably was. "They were lonely," Rosie continued, apparently oblivious to the fact that she was surrounded by beings who could reduce her to component atoms. "So I thought they might like some company." One of the Kitherian guards raised his weapon, some sort of energy projection device that hummed with barely contained violence. The juvenile Kithans responded instantly, their protective formation tightening as low warning growls rumbled from 6 throats simultaneously. "Stand down!" Vexitar barked, and the guard's weapon powered down immediately. The War Prime's amber eyes were fixed on his nephew, the one Rosie had dubbed Patches, who was positioned directly between the guard and the small human. "This is unprecedented," Vextar continued, his voice carrying currents of confusion and what might have been awe. "Kitherian juveniles do not protect prey species." "Maybe," Amelia said carefully, "they don't see her as prey. Then what do they see her as?" "Pack," Jackson said quietly, the word carrying implications that sent ripples of unease through the assembled Kithans. War Prime Vextar's head crest flared in patterns Amelia had never seen before. "Impossible. Our juveniles are conditioned against pack bonding. It interferes with individual combat effectiveness." "Daddy!" Rosie called from the center of her impenetrable fortress of prehistoric-looking bodyguards. "Can I finish the story? We're right at the good part where everyone learns to be friends. Rosie, I need you to come here right now." "But they're not done listening." "Right now, young lady." Rosie sighed with the profound disappointment of someone whose artistic vision was being curtailed by parental authority. She closed the book and started to stand, then paused as Patches made a soft, questioning sound. "It's okay," she told him, reaching up to pat his massive snout. "I have to go back to the boring grown-up meeting. But maybe I can come back later and finish the story." Patches made a sound that was part purr, part whine, and entirely heartbreaking. "He wants me to stay," Rosie announced. "The juvenile wants—" Vexitar trailed off, staring at his nephew with the expression of someone whose entire worldview was being deconstructed by a kindergartner and her picture book. Rosie took a step toward the adults, and the reaction was immediate. All 6 juveniles moved with her, maintaining their protective formation while making distressed sounds that Amelia had never heard any Kitherian produce. "They're keening," she whispered. "They're what now?" Jackson asked. "Keening. It's a distress call. Pack animals make that sound when they're separated from family members." War Prime Vextar went very, very still. "Kitherian juveniles do not keen. We have bred that weakness out of our species. Apparently not as thoroughly as you thought." One of the guards stepped forward. "War Prime, Shall we retrieve the human juvenile by force? The response was immediate and decisive. 6 young Kithans moved as one, placing themselves between the guard and Rosie, while issuing warning sounds that made the ship's hull vibrate. Patches, the smallest and apparently the most protective, bared teeth that could shred battle armor while keeping his body positioned to shield the small human. "I would not recommend that course of action," Vextar said dryly. "So what do we do?" Jackson asked. "I have no idea," Vexitar admitted, and somehow that honesty was more terrifying than any threat he could have made. "This situation has no precedent in Kitherian history." Rosie, apparently deciding that the adults were taking too long to figure out an obvious solution, sat back down and reopened her book. "I'll just finish the story while you decide." Chapter 3. How the Wolf Learned to Play Nice. The juveniles immediately settled around her again, their attention focusing on her voice with laser-like intensity. Their distress calls faded to contented rumbles as she began reading about friendship, cooperation, and the radical idea that being different didn't have to mean being enemies. War Prime Vextar watched his carefully trained weapons of mass destruction, learning about the power of kindness, and for the first time in his military career, he had absolutely no idea what to do next. "Commander Reed," he said finally, "I believe your offspring has just accomplished something that our greatest warriors have failed to achieve in 3 centuries of conquest." "What's that?" Vexitar's amber eyes never left the scene before him. 6 apex predators hanging on every word of a human child's bedtime story. "She has made our juveniles care about something other than killing." And in the transparent dome of the observation deck, surrounded by creatures that could conquer worlds, Rosie Reed continued reading about a little rabbit who taught a big, scary wolf that sometimes the strongest thing you can do is choose to be gentle. What followed could only be described as the galaxy's most polite hostage situation, if hostage situations typically involved bedtime stories and impromptu lessons in interspecies friendship. War Prime Vextar had commanded fleets, conquered star systems, and once personally negotiated the surrender of an entire civilization using nothing but strategic intimidation and a really impressive helmet. None of his military training had prepared him for a 5-year-old human who had somehow convinced his nephew to play patty cake. "Patches, you're supposed to clap when I clap," Rosie explained patiently, demonstrating the complex hand-eye coordination required for the ancient human ritual. "Like this. Clap, clap, clap." The juvenile Kitherian, whose massive claws could tear through starship hull plating, carefully attempted to mimic the motion. The result looked less like patty cake and more like someone applauding very, very slowly. But Rosie's delighted giggle suggested this was exactly the response she'd been hoping for. "He's getting it," she announced to the assembled adults, who were still standing in the doorway like tourists witnessing a natural disaster. "Smart dragon." "Rosie," Jackson said carefully, "we really need to—" "Daddy, shh. We're having a lesson. Patches is learning about games." Vexitar made that static sound again, but this time it carried undertones of something that might have been wonder. "Our juveniles do not play games." "Everyone should play games," Rosie declared, with the absolute certainty of someone who had never encountered a problem that couldn't be solved with the right combination of imagination and snacks. "Games are how you learn to be friends. Kitherans do not have friends. We have allies, subordinates, and prey." That sounds lonely. The simplicity of the statement hit the observation deck like a small, truthful bomb. Vextar's head crest rippled in patterns that Amelia's xenobiological training suggested might indicate deep contemplation, or possibly acute indigestion. "We are not lonely," he said, but something in his voice suggested he was trying to convince himself as much as anyone else. "We are strong." "You can be strong and have friends," Rosie pointed out. "Look at Patches. He's really strong, but he's also really nice." As if summoned by his name, Patches made a soft, questioning noise and gently bumped Rosie's shoulder with his snout. She reached up and scratched behind his head ridges, which produced a sound that was definitely not in any Kitherian military manual. "Is he purring?" Amelia whispered. "Kitherian juveniles do not purr," Vexitar said automatically, even as his nephew continued making sounds that were unmistakably purr-adjacent. "Well, somebody should tell him that," Jackson muttered. The situation became even more complex when the ship's communication system crackled to life with an announcement that made every adult in the room go very, very pale. "War Prime Vextar to the observation deck. Great War Prime Zakthul's transport has arrived ahead of schedule. ETA to docking. 15 minutes. Vexitar's reaction was immediate and visceral. His head crest flared in patterns that Amelia's translation implant rendered as various combinations of terror, respect, and the kind of military panic that typically preceded very bad career moves. "The Great War Prime," he said slowly, "cannot see this." "Why not?" Rosie asked innocently. "Because he will order the immediate termination of any juvenile showing signs of contamination." "Contamination?" Jackson's voice cracked slightly. "You mean my daughter?" "I mean the behavioral modifications your offspring has introduced to our broodstock. Great War Prime Zakthul considers any deviation from standard aggression protocols to be a capital offense." Amelia felt her world tilt sideways. "You're talking about killing them." "I am talking about maintaining the genetic purity of our warrior caste." "They're children. They are weapons that have been compromised." The juvenile Kithans, who had been listening to this exchange with growing agitation, began making sounds that started as distressed keening and escalated toward something that might charitably be called protective fury. Patches positioned himself directly in front of Rosie, his massive form radiating menace toward anyone who might threaten his tiny pack sister. "Oh," Vexitar said quietly, "this is significantly worse than I thought." "What do you mean?" Jackson demanded. "They understand the threat. Juvenile Kithans are not supposed to possess tactical reasoning capabilities until their third molt." "Maybe," Amelia suggested, with the careful tone of someone walking through a minefield. "Your species is more intelligent than your training methods assume. Intelligence without control is chaos. Intelligence with compassion is civilization." The philosophical debate was interrupted by Rosie, who had apparently decided that the adults were taking too long to solve what she considered a perfectly simple problem. "If the mean one is coming," she announced, "then we should hide." "Hide." Vexitar repeated the concept like it was a foreign language. "Like hide and seek, but serious. Patches and his friends can come with us back to our ship, and then the mean one won't be able to hurt them." The silence that followed was pregnant with implications that threatened to give birth to an interstellar incident. "You," Vexitar said slowly, "are suggesting that we smuggle 6 Kitherian juveniles aboard a human diplomatic vessel. I'm suggesting we save them from someone who wants to hurt them just for learning how to be nice. That would be treason against the Kitherian Empire." "Sometimes," Jackson found himself saying, "the right thing to do is the treasonous thing to do." Vexitar stared at him with the expression of someone whose entire moral framework was being reconstructed in real time. "You would risk interstellar war to protect juveniles of a species you barely know?" I would risk interstellar war to protect any child from being murdered for the crime of developing empathy." "Daddy's right," Rosie added helpfully. "Besides, they're my friends now. You don't let bad people hurt your friends." The juvenile Kithans, who had been following this conversation with obvious intelligence, despite their supposed lack of tactical reasoning, began making sounds that Amelia realized were expressions of hope mixed with determination. Patches approached War Prime Vextar directly, his massive head lowered in what might have been submission or might have been a request. The sounds he made were complex, layered with meaning that transcended species barriers. "What is he saying?" Rosie asked. Vextar's amber eyes were fixed on his nephew with an expression that might have been pride or might have been heartbreak. "He is asking for permission to choose his own pack." "And what are you going to tell him?" War Prime Vextar, terror of 3 star systems and hammer of the Kitherian Empire, looked at his nephew, then at the small human who had accidentally started a revolution and made the most treasonous decision of his military career. "I am going to tell him that sometimes the strongest choice is the one that protects what you love." Great War Prime Zakthul arrived like a natural disaster, wearing ceremonial armor. 15 feet of concentrated violence and barely controlled fury, he dominated the observation deck's entrance with the presence of someone who had never encountered a problem that couldn't be solved through strategic application of overwhelming force. His amber eyes swept the scene before him. 6 juvenile Kithans arranged protectively around a tiny human. War Prime Vextar standing in obvious moral crisis, and what appeared to be the aftermath of story time conducted by apex predators. "Explain," he said, and somehow that single word carried enough menace to make the ship's hull plating vibrate sympathetically. Vextar straightened to attention with the mechanical precision of someone facing a court-martial. "Great War Prime, there has been an incident." "I can see that. Why is there a human juvenile in our secure breeding facility?" "She wandered in during the diplomatic negotiations." "And why?" Zakthul continued, his voice dropping to temperatures that could freeze helium. "Are our juveniles exhibiting pack-bonding behaviors with alien prey?" "They appear to have formed an emotional attachment." "Then they are compromised." Zakthul's massive hand moved to the ceremonial blade at his side. "Contaminated genetic material must be purged before it can spread." The reaction was immediate and unified. 6 juvenile Kithans rose as one, their protective formation tightening around Rosie, while issuing warning sounds that made the observation deck's transparent walls hum with harmonic resonance. Patches positioned himself directly between Zakthul and the small human, his head lowered in a threat display that would have impressed his instructors if they weren't planning to execute him for it. "Fascinating," Zakthul observed with clinical detachment. "They demonstrate tactical coordination and protective instincts toward a non-Kitherian. This level of behavioral corruption exceeds our worst-case scenarios." "Great War Prime," Vextar began carefully. "Perhaps we should consider." "There is nothing to consider. The juveniles will be terminated immediately, followed by the alien contamination source." "Hey!" Rosie stood up with the righteous indignation of someone whose bedtime story had been rudely interrupted. "That's mean. They didn't do anything wrong." Zakthul's attention focused on her with the intensity of a targeting laser. "The alien speaks. I'm not an alien, you're an alien, and you're being really mean to my friends." "Your friends," Zakthul repeated, "are weapons of the Kitherian Empire. They do not belong to you. They don't belong to anybody. They're people, not things." Jackson stepped forward every parental instinct screaming at him to put himself between his daughter and 15 feet of homicidal space lizard. Great War Prime, perhaps we can discuss this diplomatically. There is nothing to discuss. Guards, execute the contaminated juveniles immediately. The guards moved forward with professional efficiency, weapons charging with sounds like impending doom. The juvenile Kithans responded by forming an impenetrable wall of scales and claws, their warning growls escalating to sounds that probably violated several noise ordinances. And then, something unprecedented happened. War Prime Vextar stepped between his superior and the juveniles, his own weapons drawn and powered. I cannot allow this, Great War Prime. The silence that followed could have been bottled and sold as a weapon of mass destruction. You, Zakthul said slowly, are committing treason. I am protecting juveniles who have committed no crime other than learning to care about something beyond themselves. Caring is weakness. Caring is what makes strength worth having. Zakthul's head crest flared in patterns that suggested he was reconsidering his entire chain of command. You would betray your own species for alien contamination? I would save my species from becoming something that destroys its own children for the crime of developing empathy. Behind Vextar, the juvenile Kithans had gone completely still, their intelligent eyes tracking the conversation with obvious understanding. Patches made a soft sound, not quite a whimper, not quite a question, that somehow conveyed volumes about loyalty, trust, and the terrible weight of adult decisions. Rosie, apparently deciding that the grown-ups were making this unnecessarily complicated, walked directly up to Great War Prime Zakthul with the fearless confidence of someone who had never met a problem that couldn't be solved through direct communication. Mr. Scary Dragon, she said politely, you're making everyone sad. Don't you want them to be happy? Zakthul stared down at her with the expression of someone encountering a completely novel form of life. Happiness is irrelevant. Only strength matters. But being mean doesn't make you strong. It just makes you lonely. I am not lonely. I am supreme. Same thing, Rosie said, with the devastating logic of childhood. Something shifted in Zakthul's amber eyes. For just a moment, the mask of supreme authority slipped, revealing something that might have been ancient pain or profound exhaustion. You know nothing of strength, small alien. I know Patches is strong, and he's also kind. I know my daddy is strong, and he protects people. I know strong people don't hurt babies just for being nice. Zakthul looked from the small human to the juvenile Kithans, then to War Prime Vextar, who stood ready to fight his own superior for the right to protect children who weren't even his species. This is madness, he said finally. Yes, Vextar agreed. It is also right. The Great War Prime stood in silence for a long moment, weighing millennia of military tradition against the evidence before his eyes. That strength without compassion was just another form of weakness. The juveniles, he said finally, will be transferred to human custody. Any Kitharian who chooses to follow this path of contamination will be considered exiled from the Empire. I accept exile, Vexatar said immediately. And I accept new family, Rosie announced cheerfully, throwing her arms around Patches's massive leg in what was possibly the galaxy's first interspecies group hug. As the human diplomatic vessel prepared for departure, carrying 6 juvenile Kithans and 1 reformed War Prime toward an uncertain but hopeful future, Rosie settled down for a nap in the cargo bay. Around her, her enormous adoptive siblings arranged themselves in a protective circle. their purring creating a lullaby that could probably be heard in neighboring star systems. Commander Jackson Reed watched his daughter sleep, surrounded by apex predators who had chosen gentleness over violence, and realized that humanity's greatest diplomatic victory had been achieved not through superior technology or military might, but through a 5-year-old with a picture book and the revolutionary idea that everyone, even scary space dragons, deserved to hear a bedtime story. The galaxy would never be the same. 3 months later, the diplomatic hope had become something of a legend in human space, partly for successfully negotiating humanity's first major alliance with a predator species, but mostly for being the only starship in known history where bedtime stories were considered essential to operational security. War Prime Vextar, now calling himself simply Vex, had adapted to exile with the philosophical grace of someone who'd discovered that losing everything he thought he wanted had given him everything he actually needed. He spent his days learning human customs, his evenings helping with juvenile Kitharian integration protocols, and his nights standing guard outside Rosie's quarters with the dedication of someone who understood that protecting innocence was the highest form of strength. The juvenile Kithans had thrived beyond all expectations. Patches had learned to play 17 different human games, though his version of tag tended to involve significantly more property damage than the traditional rules suggested. The others had developed their own relationships with various crew members, turning the ship into an unlikely but highly effective interspecies community. Dr. Amelia Reed's research papers on behavioral plasticity in apex predator species were already being hailed as groundbreaking, though she suspected future xenobiologists would struggle to replicate her methodology of introduce kindergartner, observe results, try not to panic. Commander Jackson Reed had been promoted twice and offered his choice of assignments, but he'd politely declined anything that didn't involve bringing his daughter to work. Some lessons he'd learned were too important to risk forgetting. And somewhere in the depths of space, other Kitharian juveniles in other breeding facilities had begun making sounds their instructors didn't recognize. Soft, questioning calls that might have been the first words of a revolution that started with a little girl who believed everyone deserved to hear a story about friendship.